Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the podcast. You are listening to Crime Tales from Travels. I'm your host. You can call me Cairo. Let's dive right in today. But before we do that, I want to just take a hot second to kind of remind everyone the premise of the podcast. We're not just covering kind of like quote unquote the big cases. We're choosing cases from locations of places that we have traveled to and from. Maybe we spent some time there. We might have just passed through on a road trip, but hopefully you get the idea. Like there are places that are personal to us, my spouse and I, in our travels, and stories that we find, interesting from those locations, and then wanting to spotlight those or shed some additional light on those cases. Having said that, I am quite familiar with Indiana University. I am originally from Indiana and I have been there many times. I actually applied to two universities many years ago. When it was time to go to college, I applied to IU and I applied to Ball State University. And at the time, I was planning on being a teacher. And in Indiana at that time, Ball State University was where teachers went to school to go to college. Boy, times have changed, but you get the idea. I am quite familiar with Indiana University as a result of that, and that is the location for today's particular episode. So, if you're familiar at all with Indiana University, think of just honestly a very vibrant campus known for its truly gorgeous, like limestone buildings. There's a very, very distinct look to campus. It's truly gorgeous. Certain times of the year when everything's in peak and bloom, it's truly breathtaking. It is an absolutely gorgeous campus. There's Big Ten energy in the air. There's a student community there that feels like its own small city. The university is kind of in a good way, the pulse of the overall Bloomington community. It's a great place. If you've never been, maybe you can consider, stopping if you have an opportunity to do so. But in April of 2015, that sense of safety on campus, that community, it took a hit. It shattered a little bit when 22-year-old at the time IU senior Hannah Wilson, she disappeared after a night out with friends. What followed was a case that it did move very, very quickly, but it raised some difficult questions and frustrations, and it left a campus grieving for a young woman whose life was just about ready to begin. Her adult life was just about ready to begin. So this is the story of Hannah Wilson, who she was, what happened the night that she vanished and then was found, and how investigators identified her killer within only a few hours. Before we can talk about the crime, though, I think it's really important that we talk about Hannah Wilson and who she was. She was born in Fishers, Indiana, and that's a suburb just northeast of Indianapolis. But she grew up in a close-knit family. She had, obviously her parents, her siblings, and a wide circle of friends who, from the research, just described her as warm, funny, and kind of just fiercely loyal individual. But she was the kind of person who made people feel included, the kind of person who checked in, somebody who might remember birthdays or just maybe just showed up when she knew somebody might have needed something. And at Indiana University, Hannah was a senior and she was majoring in psychology. She had plans to pursue a career in mental health counseling. She was just weeks from graduation. The cap and gown had been ordered, the job applications were underway. They were talking about a woman whose just future was just wide open for her. Hannah was also a member of a sorority. It was Gamma Phi Beta, if I'm not mistaken. And, they did an awful lot of philanthropic work within the sorority and just campus involvement in general. Her sorority sisters had later said that she was kind of the heart of the house, the one who could turn a stressful week into moments of laughter and memories, right? Um, Not the type of person by any means living a risky lifestyle. She wasn't involved in anything that anyone could see or that I could read about. That nothing that was dangerous, right? It was this normal college student, this college senior who she's doing what college seniors do. She's finishing classes, she's celebrating milestones, she's spending time with friends. And honestly, maybe that's why it makes the case a little bit extra devastating. So the specific night in question that Hannah, essentially vanished for a while was April 23rd. It was 2015. Was Little 500 Week. This is IU's biggest annual event. If you're familiar with the area, then you know what it is. Think like this mix of like a homecoming energy on a university campus mixed with something along the lines of, say, like a spring fever. Students are out, bars are packed, the campus is just buzzing with even more energy than what it already normally is. And she was out that night with some friends. They had pre-gamed at a friend's house, and then they headed to one of the bars in the Kirkwood Avenue area. But at some point, her friends had indicated that Hannah had realized that she was a little too intoxicated to stay out. So they did what was responsible, and they put her in a cab and they sent her home. And it's really important to note here, Hannah made it home that night. She was dropped off at her house on East 8th Street around 1 a.m. But the thing is, she never made it inside. What happened between the moment she stepped out of the cab and the moment that her body was found would become kind of just the central mystery of the case overall. And unfortunately, then the next morning, April 24th, around 8:30 a.m., a woman driving along Plum Creek Road in rural Brown County. It's about 20 minutes away from campus. Brown County's beautiful. There are some pretty rural areas, just outside of Bloomington. But she saw something on the side of the road, and unfortunately, it was Hannah. She had been killed and left in a remote area, mostly known to just the locals within that area. So it's not necessarily something that the IU students would have known about if they had never really ventured off campus or outside of Bloomington. There were no signs that she had been robbed. There were no signs that she had been sexually assaulted. Her purse and her phone were found nearby. This wasn't a crime of opportunity necessarily. So, it wasn't random chaos. It kind of just looked like, at least from the research, it kind of just felt like targeted violence. And investigators, they knew that they needed to find answers really fast. From the research, though, it seems apparent that pretty quickly investigators were able to find a clue pretty early on in their investigation. And it was something as simple as a cell phone. Yes, Hannah's cell phone and purse were found nearby, kind of ruling out robbery, but also near Hannah's body, police found a Samsung Galaxy phone that it didn't belong to her from what they could tell. But when they tracked it down, it did belong to a man named Daniel Messel. He was a 49-year-old Bloomington resident, and he had, it's more than a checkered past. It was quite a past. It was full of battery and domestic violence, and honestly, a past that it had gone unchecked for what seemed for a while. But when officers went to his home, they found blood on his clothing and damage to his vehicle. The damage on the vehicle was consistent with a crime scene or the drop point, and the blood on his clothing certainly started to tell even more of the story for investigators. Messel had a story. He claimed that he had been playing trivia that night before, but his story just didn't match the evidence that they found. Right, the blood on the clothing and the damage to his car. Phone records, when they did a little bit, dig a little bit deeper, phone records had placed him near Hannah's house. His car was seen in the area where her body was found, and the physical evidence that tied him directly to her. And honestly, within hours, Messel was arrested. We do need to spend a few moments talking about Daniel Messel and who he was, because it's pertinent to the story, not because we want to glorify his name or give him any more publication than necessary. But it is pertinent to the story, and he wasn't a student. He wasn't connected to Hannah at all. He wasn't someone that, from research and what the investigation, he didn't know her. He didn't have any reason to be interacting with Hannah. He was a middle-aged man with a history of violence against women, a history that in hindsight, it was honestly, that history it provided more of a warning that people just didn't pay attention to. People in his life, law enforcement in the area, judges or attorneys that might have gone a little easy on him, he seemed to go unchecked for a while. Investigators believe, though, that he encountered Hannah shortly after she was dropped off at home. Whether he approached her or offered her a ride or forced her into his car, a lot of those details are, I believe, still unclear. But what is clear is that she never made it inside her house. The investigation did conclude that. Ultimately, Messel was charged with murder and in 2016, and he was convicted and sentenced up to 80 years in prison. As you can imagine, for IU at this time, with this situation, for any university campus, any school to have to endure the loss of one of their own like this, you can imagine, I believe, probably just the significant impact to a campus. Hannah's death, it shook IU. Students who had walked the same streets, taken the same classes, shared cabs, lived the same, routines. All these students suddenly felt, individuals in this community probably felt more vulnerable than what they had before. Her sorority held vigils. Her professors spoke about her potential. Her family described her as a daughter who was very kind and driven and just deeply loved. I mean, we're talking about a human whose profession, she was getting ready to go into mental health counseling. From all accounts and for all intents and purposes, from what we can find, she was just a wonderful human being who was celebrating Little 500. This is an IU thing. A lot of students are out celebrating, and she just never got to make it home. IU did create a scholarship in her honor. Her hometown built some memorials, her hometown of Fishers, Indiana. And every April, people remember her, not for the way that she had died necessarily, but for the way that she lived her life and the way she was living her life and planning to live her long-term adult life. Hannah was living her life, and she was living her life in a good way. And it kind of sounds like with the schooling and the career she had chosen and how her friends and even her professors spoke of her, it sounds like she was doing it right. She went out with friends that night. She accepted help getting a ride home. She was steps from safety. Her story, though, I believe, is a reminder that violence doesn't always come from the shadows. Sometimes it comes from people you might not know, or you should never even come in contact with. People who should never, be free to harm again. It comes from places like that. Not always people that we know, and we're worried about the people that we know. It's just in a lot of different ways. It's random encounter. We said targeted violence, but he didn't know her, so it was random to a certain extent. What we also know is that Hannah's life, it mattered. And that's what we want to focus on and choose to remember today when we think about her story. And it is April, and it's nearing, as I'm recording this, it's April 14th, so it's nearing the anniversary mark, and which made it a little bit timely for us to try to tell this story. Thank you, though, to everyone who's tuning in to Crime Tales from Travels. If you like these kinds of stories, please feel free to leave a good review, like, subscribe, any of the things. They all help the podcast and or the YouTube channel. But we appreciate you tuning in. These stories are personal to us, not necessarily because we knew the individual, but because we're very familiar with the space. As someone who, and I don't talk about the actual details of my work, but I'm a higher education professional by day. So when I tell stories about what's happening on college campuses, it's very personal to me. It's very personal to me. So these stories mean a great deal to us. So if you like these types of stories, feel free to share stories in the comments below, or like or subscribe, or the things like that. It certainly does help. But until next time, though, let's remember to stay curious, stay safe, and sometimes we also need to remember that the truth is often stranger and more disturbing than fiction.